Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chris Maloney, and I'm I'm making this little talk now in view of the fact there may well be a transport strike on Tuesday, and I may not be able to attend Rudi's Memorial myself. I would nevertheless like to speak in his memory. I realise this is not the most salubrious environment for a memorial talk, but it is a place where Rudy and I often talked. Um, and as I think on him now, it's rather nice to be sitting here and speaking about him as I think about him. Um, Rudy and I met, I think, in 1991. Our two boys were playing football on that football ground adjacent to Gladesville Bridge on the Hunters Hill side. And our boys were playing Hunters Hill, and they weren't doing very well. Rudy and I, like other parents, were charging up and down the length of the football field. We were much younger then, of course. And at some point, I remarked to Rudy, I recognised him as a parent of one of our kids, that, you know, they just didn't seem to understand the game, the spirit of the game properly. And he engaged me in conversation, and he pointed out to me that what was going on was really very, very interesting. You see, he said, the Hunters Hill boys, their dads will be bank executives, lawyers, judges, big shot doctors, that sort of thing. They don't think. They don't do reflection. They're action men. They go straight to what needs to be done and get on with it. Our boys, though, you watch what they're doing. They get the ball, they put their foot on it, they look around, they see where everybody is, they can consider their options, and eventually they will go to make a move, but in the meantime, more often than not, these Hunters Hill kids, they're like savages. They come and take the ball. It's pretty hard. It's a pretty unequal team or match when you think about the two teams cast in those kinds of, I guess, psychological personality mindsets. I'm speculating there, but Rudy's commentaries or explanation intrigued me because I recognised myself as one of those kids who, when he gets the ball, doesn't move quickly on it, but stops and thinks, this is a ball. What can you do with a ball? I look around and I consider my range of options and my preferences, and eventually I move, and more often than not, the opportunity is passed on in the meantime. Nevertheless, Rudy and I became fast friends out of that conversation, and I had been doing management consulting at the time in my work, and I introduced Rudy to colleagues of mine, and he embarked on that kind of career direction also. I think he had clients everywhere. They were always interested in what he had to say and what he thought, as I had been. But to speak about him now, I want to start with a quotation, and it's from a Japanese sage of the last century who said, to go east 1 mile is the same as to go west 1 mile. I read that many years ago, and it had stuck in my mind as an odd thing to say, an odd statement. I mean, was it meant as a truism? To go east 1 mile is the same as to go west 1 mile, and that's the fact? Was it a provocation to think deeply and differently about what we do, how we value our choices? Was it the observation of an extraterrestrial making a passing visit? Or could it be that everything we do is simply an oscillation. I recall putting that quote to Rudi one afternoon, and we were driving to Homebush in my car, and I must have said it as we were crossing Burwood Road. The discussion that followed, it took the form that was not unusual. Rudi was explaining to me how I should be thinking about things. He had a duty to me as his friend to help me reason more usefully and in a way that was more likely to yield a result, a positive result, a meaningful result, than the way in which I normally thought, which he considered very haphazard. Um, I grew frustrated with it, with the lecture, because I mean I was genuinely intrigued by the question, and I imagined, because Rudi seemed to have read everything, that he would be acquainted with an Eastern perspective on life as he was on Western perspectives, Western European perspectives particularly. Um, I grew frustrated and I cut him off. I said something like, "I'm sorry, Rudi, that doesn't work for me. I want to know what it means. I'm impatient. Um, if you don't know, and none of these people you talk about all the time know, well, then I'm ready to kick off, start again. I've had enough. I don't want to live in this puzzlement all my life, or for a long life anyway." He came straight back with, "You're dead a long time." And I countered. I said, "Well, really, you can't figure it out. None of the guys you talk about all the time could figure it out. Then, yes, bring on the next big adventure. We're wasting our time." Um, the truth we both knew in that moment was that no one was better able to reason than Rudi was. No one knew the other great minds, in the Western tradition anyway, than Rudi did. Yet, not even he was able to penetrate far into this mysterious world of metaphysical observation, questioning. Um, our earthly circumstances simply have too many layers, too many textures, too many axes, too many essences, too many fragrances, too much of everything. It's simply too big. We're like a tree in the forest. We can't, we simply can't get a helicopter view. Um, but the brevity of Rudi's reply, "You're dead a long time," surprised me, because it was uncharacteristically frivolous. Rudi was not a frivolous man. He had humour, but he wasn't frivolous. I never forgot that remark, and I don't think he ever forgot that conversation, because it became an intersection in our friendship. And like all intersections, that moment, it eventually took us, in both of us, in new directions, in the ways we thought about things and the things we talked about. And, and they were ways that are not always comfortable. We grew comfortable talking and thinking about things that were problematic, but not necessarily answerable. Rudy told me many times afterwards that I was a poet. I thought like a poet. And he was a philosopher. And he thought like a philosopher. Our thinking styles were radical to each other, but they were synchronous. We liked to mull the same things. Rudy's project to circumscribe reality was in every sense the most ambitious project I think any intelligent mind can take on. Excuse me, I'm just having a little reflection. He had calculated that since intelligence works and intelligence, intelligence can be seen to be working, it must exist. And if intelligence exists, by its nature, all reality must be intelligible. Just as light overcomes darkness and reveals the matter that was always there, intelligence is everywhere too, and it is in fact the substance of every perfect composition. Moreover, that which is intelligently constructed must therefore be able to be intelligently understood and intelligently explained. For me, hearing that perspective was in a number of ways quite transformational. And as transformational for Rudi was an emerging sense that that perspective, everything must be intelligible, was intrinsically limited. Especially after he arrived in Blaney, I observed him forming new insights about the nature of reason itself. I'll call them poetic insights because the insight he was gaining was quite different from the kind of reasoning that has such deep roots in Western philosophical tradition. I'll call it poetic insight. And it was working its way across his reasoning mind like a deep current that is unconstrained by the surface waves and the winds. You know, and we all know this particularly today, our lives, these lives we have, they don't go on endlessly. And during these recent years, after he moved to Blaney and we spent more and more time together, Rudi began also to lose people who were very, very dear to him. Michael Sutherland, his mother, um, and others whom I never knew, but I did know were very important to him. And You're Dead a Long Time didn't still the sadness in him. His interest in this enigma of what life means and what life is grew. And as it would in Rudi's mind, it enlarged, it widened, and he began to practice new ways to form understanding. In the last year, he spoke to me many, many times about this new kind of reasoning he was discovering that is released by wondering. And perhaps he spoke to others too about it because it had really captured him as an insight. It was the kind of reasoning that had no roots, it had no precedence. It wasn't something that you could say came from um, Vico or Erasmus or one of those. It was something Rudi was encountering himself through his own experience of inquiring. Um, his own wondering deepened and broadened in this time, and it became, as I say, less reliant on the conventional biographies and histories about the ancients, whom he still very greatly admired, but who came to him through scholars who had written about them. he realized more and more, I think, that the men like Plato and Augustine were not captured really by their biographers. And he started to consider scholarship with some disdain, um, because it was simply reportage. It wasn't itself knowledge, it wasn't discovery, and it wasn't even insight. In his mind, wondering released visions and storytelling. I never knew Rudi in the early days as a storyteller, but he became a storyteller. He described to me his wandering journey, through medieval Tuscany with Natasha a couple of years ago. Walking around Florence, he was wondering about the fact that Machiavelli's family had lived opposite the Palazzo de' Medici and quite close to where Michelangelo's family lived. And in his wondering, he was watching Lorenzo Medici, Michelangelo, and Machiavelli playing together as boys, little small boys. And then he's watching them as teenagers playing together. And he was now seeing them as adult men conducting themselves as the men they had made each other to be during these years of playing together. And no biographer I know has ever considered the Renaissance kicking off that way. And yet, how probable was it that it was those relationships that in fact gave the world a relationship, and those relationships had emerged in exactly that way, and they were characterized in that way. And the Renaissance itself was characterized in that way. The same thing has happened many times. It's not a coincidence that the Art Nouveau all happened at the same time. Art Deco, it all happened at the same time. It wasn't one artist creating a movement. It was combinations of artists in conversation with each other that created movements, and thinking together that created movements. He wondered about the conversations that Frederick Bartholdi, who gave the USA its Statue of Liberty, might have shared with Renoir and Valery and Ravel and the other artists who were hanging around Paris during those years of the Belle Epoque. Rudi, he always experienced those pathfinders as his friends and his colleagues. And he reminded me often how they had inherited their cultural traditions from the great French Enlightenment. And therefore, they should be known not only for the remarkable beauty and innovation of their art, but most importantly, for being practicing disciples of those pioneering philosophers of the 17th century. There seemed to be no end or limit to the things he observed in his wandering. I recall meeting him one morning in Blaney for a cup of coffee. With news, he was brimming with news about the Statue of Liberty. He was really beaming and brimming with news. He'd had this insight during the night. Look, he said, how everybody thinks it's the torch the statue holds, which shows the way to liberty. But it's not. He said, it's only a torch in an outstretched hand. Look, he said, at the head, the erect head, the crown. It's not a crown. It's emanating light. It's the light that emanates from the enlightened mind that gives us freedom. And human freedom for Rudi was the pinnacle of all aspiration. For him, it came through knowledge and understanding. For Bartholdi, it came also emanating from the enlightened mind. That insight, by the way, still seems to escape the USA, as it escapes our own. won't go there. Rudy promised me an essay on the Statue of Liberty and on many other things we discussed. And although he started many essays, he finished very few. You all know about this. But how could he? How can any sincere wonderer encapsulate what his ever-enlarging wonderment is leading him towards? How can he do that in a few thousand words, or even in a few million words? You can't pen in wondering. The nature of what is, though, teased him to profound frustration, and he suffered guilt and failure from his inability to complete his written work or his written works. His amassing insights, excuse me, excited him. His was the same questing ambition that drove Magellan and Vasco da Gama and Shackleton and Hillary and the other great adventurers. But their journeys paled beside Rudi's quest, because ultimately they were more or less singular, and they were confined and defined by physical geography. While Rudi worked in a paradigm that is far too multidimensional, multitextual, marvellous, even for language, any language. How could he ever encapsulate that? And what courage to try to write about it. I've often wondered how you would start. How would you start out to describe what's real? And Rudi did again and again. He tried again and again. He never gave up. His work, he called it, and it was work. It was very, very sincere work. And I admire him greatly for the struggle and the effort he persisted in. Yet, even though he saw and discovered many things, those discoveries showed him what he still needed to understand and still needed to discover. And ultimately, what he needed, more than most things, I think, was the understanding of others like me, yet, and perhaps some of you. But who among the others could understand, except we walked the same rigorous, all-consuming journey that Rudi walked? I often pressured him to release himself from the obligations that he set for himself and the standards he set for himself. And I'm grieving now that doing so, I exacerbated his frustration and the loneliness of his journey. The demands he placed on himself couldn't be negotiated, and they could never be mitigated. About a year ago, I took a mystery to him, hoping he may have already surveyed the territory. And it turned out, though, that my question opened up a new line of wondering for him. And it became the subject of another, he told me, essay in progress. And by the way, Nicky, if you find this essay, I would really like to read it, because it was something that we were both deeply engaged in. It was an important set of conversations, particularly towards the end of his life. And they're particularly important for me too. My question concerned the nature of time. It's capital T. Is time only a cultural artifact that we as people have escalated to a false importance? Or is it in fact a construction material essential to the construction of reality? If we were not aboard a planet circling a sun, would we have any sense of time? So what about the inevitable changes of growth and decay? Do they validate a notion of time? Is time contingent, therefore, on the presence of matter? Or, in other words, where there is no matter, is there no time? My question stimulated Rudi, and as I say, we spent a long time chewing on it, many, many mornings, many afternoons. He who had grappled with the nature of an electron and formed his own unanswered questions about the nature of singularity now sought to unravel the mystery of time and timelessness. Our discussions began to weave more loosely, and they often embraced and broached the nature of life itself. The interplay between time and life becomes really intriguing, especially as your close friends become fewer and we approach our own inevitable loss. If reality is actually timeless, you see, can there be what we know as death? More and more, Rudi would tell me, I want to know what God knows. And my first thought after losing him was this comforting thought that my old friend has escalated his inquiries and he's gone to find out what God knows. So, Rudi, this is not goodbye because I'm waiting to hear the news you bring back, my old friend. Thank you.